This story is about one of my fishing trips that I made into Canada. I started flying back in, and I started driving in at first in about 1961, and then the first few years we drove into a lake called White Lake. It's on Highway 17 in northern Ontario, and then we started flying in. And I would always organize these trips just because I like organizing them, and then I knew everything would be done right because I did so many of them. I'd set up the food and all that. And we would always try to get at least four guys that played euchre because a lot of times that night we'd like to play euchre. And usually the trips were set up with six men, so we'd always have four for euchre. Now, back when I first flew in, I flew into this Oswald Lake. I think we flew out of Foleyet at Thralt Air Services. And we flew into this Oswald Lake, and give you an idea of the differences between when I first started and now. Uh, it cost $42 per person back then, and that included the camp, flying in and out, a boat, and 10 gallons of gas per person. We had to take our own food and everything like that in, but still it was $42 per man. The food for a week when I was first going in there, I'd go to the store, I'd buy all the food, and then we'd split it up. It was usually about $13 per man. Now you couldn't get a day's worth for that. The lakes were usually great fishing, pike and walleye. The walleye weren't all that large, but there was a lot of them if you got into them, and you couldn't guarantee it. And the pike were big. I caught 76 pike one week, and that was the only time I really kept track, and I don't know why I did, but I kept track. I put a mark on my tackle box and I caught 76 that week, and we'd throw most of them back. We didn't bring many. And the walleyes, if you got into a nice school, you could really slaughter them. The lakes I flew into were normally rather small. They had to be big enough for a float plane, usually a beaver or a small Cessna. I usually chose a smaller lake as I wanted to have them to ourselves. Some of the larger ones will have more than one camp, and the solitude is one of the things that I always look forward to. Normally, I'd try to set it up for at least four people, like I said, and so we could play euchre. This year there was four of us: Jay, Ray, Dale, and I. It must have been sometime in the early '80s. We always rotate partners so we'd not have to fish with, not have any casualties at the end of the week. We fished two to a boat, and they were pretty small, and after 8 hours or 10 hours of fishing each day, you get the urge to strangle your best friend after you've heard the same tune hummed for a full day, and we found the rotation was best. Uh, I had one buddy that I spent a whole week with burning off to keep the black flies away. Heck, they weren't even out in the middle of the lake during the day in the breeze. He had a big can with a rag in it, and it was soaked with off. He had the damn thing smoldering for about a week. Should have strangled that sucker. Nobody else had fished with him. That off, I'm probably still got that crap in my lungs. I was fishing the day I'm going to tell you about. I was fishing with Jay. Jay, he was really a nice guy. He's still around somewhere. I haven't seen him probably in 30 years, but he was a nice guy, and we used to have a lot of fun up there. He didn't fish too much except on these trips. I used to get out fishing 3 or 4 times a week during the summer. I was a fishing fool back then. Usually casting for bass or using a fly rod for casting with a bass with spinning outfit, and using a fly rod to fish for bluegill and sunfish. I'd flip that lure almost any place I wanted to. I'd skip cast the sucker back under the cover and lay it pinpoint accuracy in the lilies. Jay only fished on these trips. He never fished any other time during the year. I would always get stuck with running the motor. It was my motor, but it gets tiresome after hours of it. Jay just wouldn't touch the damn thing and said that we could fish any place I wanted to, and I could make all the decisions as to where to fish and when we moved. It worked out good, but it could drive you nuts. We were fishing along a small bay on this lake. I can't remember the name of. The fish weren't interested. It was a beautiful lake, lots of small bays, and the rapids feed in the lake and the rapids discharge in. In fact, it was like a wide spot in the river, the lake was. It was like glass, and it was nice to listen to the loons. Very peaceful. Now, at times like this, I'd normally try to wake things up by messing with my partner. Maybe that's the real reason we rotated. I messed with all of them. Old Jay was easy, though. I'd start off bragging about how good a caster I was and how he wasn't in the same league with me, and I'd flip the sucker up tight to shore and just rag at the poor guy. He'd get mad, but he wouldn't say much. I could see that guy working him, and it was a lot of fun. And along these lakes, normally we fish the trees. They come up tight to the shore. Uh, you can't even get out of the boat in a lot of places, and this bay was no exception. There were cedar trees along the shore with their roots half exposed because of the wave action. Many of them were dead and leaning toward the lake at about a 30-degree angle or so. Skeletons of trees, actually, with all the branches but no foliage. Well, here I was, just a ragging, bragging at Jay and watching him chewing at the bait. Now he knew what I was about, as I had done it to the lad before. But slow fishing, what the heck, I had to have something to do. Jay was pretty good with that rod too, I gotta admit. He was tough to beat considering how little he fished and how much I did. What really put a half hitch in his shorts at these moments was the fact that when we had these contests, he would do pretty darn good and rub my nose and brag in my own brag. I usually had a tough time whipping him if he was having a good day, and this was one of his good days. We got a contest going, and I'd make a cast back. I'd flip one back under the brush or something. I'd say, "Try this, sucker." I'd flip that Rapala right back under the cedars, and the little vermin would watch me, or better me on occasion. I would never admit this to him. He will never hear this recording. He was just making life just a little tough on a braggart that day, and I thought I would lay one up tight as I could to shut him up. There wasn't much wind, and it was a great for control casting. I took aim at the base of one of these old dead cedars, and after giving the sucker a sarcastic grin, let fly. Well, that sucker got away from me and headed for the top of the dead tree. It was leaning right at me at about 30 feet high or so. My story, it can be as tall as I want it to be. 30-foot tree and a cast that went at least 35 feet high. That dang thing went directly on the top of that tree. Well, it didn't stop there. Now let me tell you a thing or two about a Rapala. They are a lure that's shaped like a minnow, has 3 treble hooks and a nice lip at the front that gives it the swimming action. It's a great lure for bass, pike, walleye, and cedars, I found out that day. That sucker went up and came down through those branches and all the way to the water. It was like threading a needle. I don't know how it ever got down there. It's never snagged a branch, but it didn't consider it to be a plus at this time. It was threaded down through 30 small branches. Man, it looked like, and listen to Jay's squalling and stomping on the cat. He was squalling like a stomped on cat. He was laughing and just, treating me dastardly, actually. I just looked at him and turned to old Loudmouth and asked him what he was crowing about. I told him I did it on purpose so I could give him a demonstration of how a skilled fisherman would get him out of such a predicament. He was about peeing himself with glee, the jerk. I had no idea to how I was going to perform this deed, but I knew I had to bluff it. Did I tell you that we had a beer bet on this contest? Maybe it was a 6-pack or 2. I can't remember right now. Anyway, my old buddy Jay was calling me some really uncalled for names and carrying on and laughing, and he was being awful. I can't stand a person that's mean to me like that. He was saying things like I had screwed up and he was going to lose, and I was going to lose a lure, and he was going to cut my line, and he was glad. He wasn't really showing me the proper respect, I didn't figure. I hunkered down and I started to pulling that lure up to the first little branch, and when it got there, I snuggled the lip up to it and just pulled gentle like. its old butt pulled up, and then I gently gave it a little tiny tug, and the dang thing went popping over that limb like I knew what I was doing. He started yelling that I was lucky. Wouldn't do it again. And I said, "Are you paying attention? Are you taking notes? Because there may be a test." I hadn't thought of that far ahead, but I had to have something cocky to say. Heck, I was going to be hung up in a minute, and he was going to tear me a new butt. I just knew he would. You can't trust them little guys. Well, I tell you, I worked that lure up over every one of those damn little branches, slicker than snail snot, all the while listening to him squalling. I told him that he had better have those beers ready, because this was hard work. The little vermin was getting a little tense, and I detected that in the lad by the way he was reaching for my rod and trying to set them hooks. I do think I showed a bit of poise in the way I babied that lure up out of that tree, especially considering the fact that I was laughing my butt off trying to fend off the piss ant, all the time concentrating on task at hand. Of course, I had to make sure he was studying on how I was doing the job, because I sort of had to come up with a test. Now, that is what I call multitasking. Now, as I said, I worked that lure up and out of that tree just as if I knew what I was doing. I was as shocked as he, but had the good sense to take full credit for my deed and act as though it was all part of my plan. He wasn't buying it, though. Now, I did stroke the boy and told him that he was almost as good as me, and if the chore was ever his, now he knew how to do it. He started spouting off that he wasn't stupid enough to get himself in such a situation and all that guff. Well, he and I had been friends for some time. In fact, he was my foreman at work. He should have known that you can never be real sure of some things. My old buddy Jay was sitting at the front of the boat, and I was in the rear as usual. I asked him where he'd like to go. He told me where I could go. I said I meant fishing. He said in a sort of grumpy way, "You're running the boat, dickhead." What a spoil sport. It's only going to cost him a beer, because and he did learn something. Well, he was sitting there with his pole, and his pole had a rapala on it, and darned if it wasn't within my reach. I had an inspiration. I said, "Jay, old buddy, how about pulling up the anchor?" He starts to pulling it up, and I just reached over there and snatched up his rod, and darned if it didn't make another perfect cast. down like the one I made on my own lure. It went down through them branches like a smelt through a seagull. He looked up. I wish I had a picture of his face, poor baby. Started yelling, squalling like a mashed cat. I asked him if he had been paying attention, and the lad got a little bit cocky. He says, "If you can do it, so could I." Well, the boy just wasn't smart. I watched for a minute and saw that he just might do it. He picked up that rod, and he sat there, and he had been paying attention. He popped over the first one and popped over the second one. And now it gets a little boring for me to sit there and watch a guy do that, so I gets a notion. I starts up that motor, and he turns and looks at me. He said, "What the hell are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going fishing." He looks at his line. He looks up at the tree. He looks at me, and I crank up that motor and head for the center of the lake. He starts screaming, of course. The motors make a lot of noise, and all I can do is I couldn't catch it all. I look at him, and he is a bit tense. That pole is jumping, the line is shooting off the reel. Heck, the way I looked at it, he should have been happy that he got his bail open in time and the line could spool off. We look at things different, I guess. He did get a little pissy with me. Got to admit that. Heck, it was my face that the line was shooting past, and I was the one in the back of the boat. He just wasn't thinking of himself at home, any but himself. Upshot of all is the fact that he must not have been paying attention. He failed his test. His lure is probably still on the top of that cedar. He lost a bunch of line, saved his rod and reel. This is all you can All because I did yell, "Hold on to your rod tight." You know that when that monofilament cuts loose, it just makes a heck of a noise. I did have to give him a Rapala, 100 yards at 20-pound strand, and he was in such poor sport. After all, he was the one that failed the contest. I didn't. Jeez. We got back to camp. We all both paid off the other, and when the beer was gone, all was forgiven. I couldn't hold it against him because he called me all them names. He don't even know my mama. I haven't seen Jay in years, 30 or so. I have enjoyed telling this story as it gave me a chance to relive it. I haven't thought about it in a long time. There's the story about Jay and I getting stranded for the night on the Albany River, which empties into James Bay, but that'll have to be another story. Man, that was a trip. This trip to the Chapleau River in northern Ontario. Heck, I didn't even know this boy was scared of bears. But that's another story. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for listening.